Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video in the Big Idea series. We're here today with Dr. Shubho Roy, who is faculty at Shiv Nadar Law School in Chennai. So tell us, Shubho, what's your big idea?
My big idea is that you cannot have a functioning judicial system by ignoring courts and encouraging alternate dispute resolution like arbitration.
Okay. So in the last 5-10 years, there has been a big push towards setting up India as some kind of arbitration center. So you've seen arbitration centers spring up in different cities. And there was a big push by the government to encourage arbitration and contracts. They seem to have changed their mind. At least the union has in the last few years through some notifications. So why don't you paint the picture for us? Uh, where do you see the role of arbitration? Why do you think arbitration is successful or not? And where do you see judicial capacity in link to this?
So, this idea flows from an observation that across the world there are some popular international arbitration centers. They include countries like Singapore, cities like London, Paris for international commercial arbitration, or cities like New York, which have also become centers of arbitration. And uh, the beauty about international arbitration is it's a competitive market. Parties, usually very wealthy, involving large value contracts, can choose where they can go. So the arbitration jurisdiction, which is able to provide the best quality of judicial services, is able to attract that transaction. The interesting feature is that almost all the countries or jurisdictions which have attracted arbitration seem to have already got very well functioning judiciaries. There have been some countries which have tried to skip this also. Dubai comes to mind, which has invested a lot on the arbitration center system, but has not been able to fundamentally eat into the market or come up as a competitor, surprisingly, in spite of a lot of state effort and spending of money against these established players. That gives us pause to think, why can't we have a system? Why don't we have countries where the judiciary doesn't work and the arbitration system takes over? It seems to be cheap, it seems to be attractive. We do not know why, but there can be some indicators for this. And roughly the indicators are at two levels. One is that the existing legal framework of that country usually becomes the jurisdiction under which the arbitration happens. So if somebody says that we are going to arbitrate in London and international uh, arbitration, they state that it will be as per common laws of England. So the jurisdiction of the country's laws quality also attract arbitration systems. So the country's judicial system seems to be good. The legal systems have to be good. And the second part comes from enforceability. This is the gray area of whether it's a judicial function or an executive function. But this is the function where if a party loses and the losing party refuses to cooperate in, say, paying the award or doing some activity, say vacating a building, the legal system is strong enough to send what we would consider bailiffs or enforcement officers or recovery officers to quickly recover the money or ensure that the winning party is placed in the property that they have won and ensure their safety and security for a significant period of time. This enforcement capacity is probably what attracts people to these countries where there is international arbitration. India probably falters on both and therefore may not be able to use arbitration as uh, as an escape clause to the dysfunctional judiciary.
So let's pick the first question. Let's pick up the first part before we come to the execution, which is the sort of capacity to actually adjudicate complex matters, perhaps international, perhaps national. But these are let's start with complex commercial cases. Can you elaborate a little bit more on? One would have thought, Indian judges, Indian legal professionals, well regarded. Um, one would have thought India, by virtue of that, would have capacity. But so let's dig a little deeper and understand why you disagree.
So, India is a common law country. It has a well-functioning judiciary compared to its level of development, established independence of judiciary in most matrices. However, uh, there may be a problem with our contract law. The Indian contract law is of an old vintage, around 1800, but that is not per se a reason for it to being incorrect. But around the 1970s and 80s, there was a revolution in the West where scholars started using economic analysis of the law and started understanding how economic incentives of parties, and terms of finance affect the way contracts are enforced. Sadly, those principles have not yet filtered into Indian contract law, statutory law, and not just contract law. There are other civil laws also which come into play. For example, if a party wins a case or an arbitration, how much interest are they entitled to for the time between the default happening or the contract breaking down to the time where they got the money? In the past, we did this intuitively. But in the 70s and 80s, we learned of economic principles like opportunity cost of money, time value of money. These are finance terms which influence the way many of these legislations were amended or changed to reflect this reality. Sometimes, even in contract law, we have to take deeper policy questions. Indian contract law tries to put parties back to a position before the contract if a contract breaks down. So the compensation is targeted towards just putting parties back.
So some form of restitution to ex post before the contract broke.
Yeah.
Okay.
But consider what modern corporate law or contract law wants you to do. I, as a winning party, had entered into the contract expecting some economic advantages out of it.
Right.
Or I placed certain reliance on that contract and took certain other actions, hoping, say, for example, that some tomatoes, maybe hundreds of tons of tomatoes would come to me. And then I ran my factory. I already heated up my boilers to turn them into tomato sauce. All that expectation cost should be uh, given back to me or be made whole. And you can go to one extreme and say, even that if I made whatever is the expected profit I would have made from selling tomato sauce, the person who did not deliver the tomato or probably didn't deliver the electricity on time should pay for. Uh, the trend of judgments and even the Indian contract law provisions seem to not support this point of view. This makes it competitively India's poorer jurisdiction as opposed to jurisdictions where companies or parties in an arbitration or a contract dispute are put at a better position if there is a violation or a breakdown of a contract.
So clearly, contracts and transactions, especially global in nature, are getting more complex. So you have interest rates benchmarked to some LIBOR or whatever is the new equivalent. You have downstream effects of things going wrong. You have complex supply chains. And it would seem that contracts executed by Indian firms or foreign firms would bear all of those things because Indian firms have kept up, at least in part, to some of the larger firms. But you say that while the contract may be written in such a manner, Indian law or Indian contract law and its interpretation would not necessarily allow you to benefit from those clauses because Indian contract law doesn't recognize this level of complexity.
Yes, or in the Indian contract law doesn't recognize this level of restitution when contracts break down.
So the principles itself are not necessarily, at the same level, or they don't necessarily think of contract law the same way.
Yes, and a contract that is written down will still operate within the contract legislation of that country, which is not just the bare act, all the precedents that have been created, and also other legislations like civil procedure, which determines how much interest should be paid. We sometimes have laws which say a flat interest of 6%, which is below the cost of capital for most parties to contracts, sometimes even below the cost of capital for the state.
Right.
So, which creates perverse incentives in certain ways. And it also brings to the next question of what an arbitrator in India should do.
Right.
Should an arbitrator in India write an award which is in align with the best practices of commercial law that is seen in other jurisdictions or more modern practices uh, of commercial law? Or should an Indian arbitrator write an arbitration award which is aligned with Indian law? Because when that arbitration award needs state enforcement, the judiciary will look at that award. And it is unreasonable to expect the Indian judiciary to enforce an arbitration award, which is not the one they would have come to if the case had not been arbitrated but had gone into litigation. The judiciary feels it's an anathema that a decision which they would have never done, now they are being asked to use the power of the state to enforce.
And this makes sense, right? Because even if you had the capability or if you had the capacity, you were up to date with global standards. If as an arbitrator you make some kind of award, it goes to a judge. A judge can only interpret the law as the legislation has written it. So they would be sort of forced, even if they agreed, they would be forced by the virtue of their post to stick to what Indian contract law. So judicial capacity in this regard is at least downstream of your ability to write good laws.
The judge needs to be trained and the judge needs to be empowered through legislation. And we have questions because no jurisdiction would like to enforce an arbitration award which is against public policy. So, for
Right,
example,
right.
if you write a contract which is which enforces child labor, and you take it to any jurisdiction, they would refuse to enforce a contract which involves child labor because it's against public policy of a nation. And we have some lack of clarity on some public policy principles, like, for example, if some natural resource has been nationalized, and then again it has been awarded to some private party to exploit, is that natural resource still a national property nationalized? Or because of the auction system, the public policy has changed, and now that natural resource should be considered
Private.
private property? We don't have clarity on this because in some of these cases, an auction mechanism has been maybe even written down in legislation, but the nationalization which transferred the property, be the natural resource, from private persons to the state still continues. So in that type of contracts, what do you do as a court? What public policy are you trying to enforce? Without clarity or commitment from the Indian legislation that no, we have moved away from that, and now when we award some natural resource through auctioning process or allocation process, that is the absolute property of that party. Or if it is not, then be clear on that it is not.
So you need you need good, clear legislation which is up to standards with modern interpretations of the way contracts are done. And that is perhaps the bottleneck to, because once you have that clear, I'm sure Indian judges can keep up with global literature and learn how to interpret the laws. So first, legislation needs to improve or at least catch up.
And not just contract legislation or procedural legislation on how natural resources are being awarded, legislation on how construction contracts are being awarded, or certainty about transfer of property in private public partnership. If these things are unclear, the contracts seem to be against, or the awards seem to be against stated public policy, which may have not been updated.
Right. So just in making improvements on one aspect will not be good or will not be useful, because any kind of progress needs to be buttressed by several other improvements in several other matters. And we other nations seem to have built these foundations over time. And I feel that you're saying that unless India walks that journey on all other matters, you may not just be able to say, okay, fix arbitration. Okay, you can't do arbitration because contract law is different. Okay, but you can't just change contract law either. You actually need to do like an all of systems improvement.
Yes, and maybe it will take time, but as we start improving one and the other, we should hopefully see marginal improvements in the certainty of arbitration awards. Maybe some areas will still be left. Maybe natural resource disputes will still be left with unclear laws, but maybe say employment will improve, or say banking or compensation for loans or standard contracts on trade may improve. But an overall improvement requires an overall evaluation of laws which are philosophically designed with the idea that contracts, transactions, and property transfers are the way the law are the things that the law upholds for national development or economic growth.
And you can't do this just through case law and precedents, which means that every time an issue is brought to the court, you can't use that as an opportunity to interpret the law differently unless the law itself changes.
Yes,
Like, which comes first?
because courts should not change precedent unless the primary legislation has changed something. And that is a way by which maybe if there are precedents which are not in line with modern economic principles that India seeks to uh, enforce, should be changed. It should not be asking the judge to change the precedent. We should change the underlying legislation. Then the judge looks and says that the past precedents were motivated by a legislation which no longer exists or which has fundamentally changed. And then we should go. So, for example, it may not be ideal for Indian courts to award, say, punitive damages in contracts if that is considered the better strategy in contracts. And there's some economic argument and evidence that that is a better strategy. Just because the judge read some paper from some legal academic arguing that. Because the precedents are more valuable than some less persuasive economic papers. What should happen is that the legislation should reflect it. Parliament and a democracy should decide, yes, we are shifting away from just restitution to maybe expectation damages or even expect reliance damages, and then expect the judiciary to change, which may still require training of the judiciary also, that the change in the legislation now reflects a new philosophy, and then reading on that philosophy and then enforce.
Yeah, but that is perhaps more doable or an easier sort of capacity to gain, as opposed to requiring that our entire legislative understanding of certain issues in economics and contract law, as in you can't get away with just judicial capacity without strengthening legislative capacity.
Or it would be dangerous for judges to substitute legislative wisdom for modern ideas,
Right.
just because they have personally read up on it or personally feel that it's a good way.
Correct.
That leads to a breakdown between the legislature and judiciary and creates further uncertainty in the law.
Right. So now before we come to execution, it feels like there is a step between the adjudication of the matter and the execution of the decree, which is in some sense giving parties finality, which is that what is recommended by the arbitrator is what the courts think. And this is where you mentioned that the judge needs to agree with the arbitrator.
I agree at a deeper level of this meets policy. This is in line with what the judiciary would have done. If there are minor differences that may be let go of, or you can ask a judge to show some leniency or accept the wisdom of the arbitrator that the parties chose. But let's start putting numbers. Let's say the Indian courts routinely award 6% simple interest in judgments for the time value of money. But actually, the expected time value of money in India for average parties is around 18% compound interest. If an arbitrator awards, say, 7% simple interest, or maybe 8% compound interest, a judge may be able to overlook that and say,
I'll let it go. Yeah.
But if the numbers calculated by the Indian law would have come to, say, $100 million, and the numbers calculated by the arbitrator has come to, say, $600 million, $700 million. This seems now an error apparent on the face of it, which is a ground for not enforcing or overturning an arbitral award. The distance between what the arbitrator decides and what the normal laws of the country would have decided cannot be too far.
And when the judge overturns this arbitration, it then sets the standard and sends a signal that other arbitrations will be dealt with in a similar manner if they award compound interest.
Yes. And then that creates then the parties look at it this way, that if I go to an arbitration tribunal, I don't get a better quality judgment or which reflects economic realities better, because finally it will come down to that. Instead of that, maybe go to Hong Kong, maybe go to Singapore and do it there where I have certainty. But if you go to Hong Kong or Singapore, which many Indian parties have started doing, you come to the next problem, which is of enforcement.
Right. So let's say that there is an arbitration. Let's say it's against an Indian firm, which so let's say the arbitration was not done in India, or perhaps it was. But either way, you have an arbitration decree with one party has now brought in front of a judge. The judge upholds the arbitration order. They still need to execute it. What are the challenges that India faces in this regard?
So India has strong legal systems to actually enforce awards. The Indian procedural law on enforcement of awards is not uh, uh, weak in terms of the written word. So there are provisions on how to say go into somebody's bank account and forcibly take out the money, to use the police or state forces or bailiffs to go to a building and evict a tenant who has refused to pay rent for maybe years or decades. But these are not just purely judicial functions. This involves the executive functions of putting state violence against a person. And these involve sometimes setups and systems which we may have been good in the past, but not uh, uh, not good for the modern system. So let me give an example of recovering money from a bank account. Um, in many of these older laws for enforcement, the term is used, this money will be recovered as if this is a due for land revenue.
Okay.
In the past, most common asset in India was land when we were primary agricultural society. Lot of land revenue was recovered. There was an entire machinery. After we did agricultural reforms and we reduced the taxes on land revenue to kind of reduce burden on farmers, using land revenue means you have to go to the magistrate who has the jurisdiction over the bank branch, where that bank account has been, where the losing party has a bank account, and then use it to extract the money out. While banking is centralized in India today, there are headquarters everywhere, there are branches everywhere, or the money or the record which party has how much money is stored in mostly centralized banking systems. But this entire older process has to be done. And since that process has not been used a lot for even land recovery of taxes or land revenue, the muscle has not been exercised. It is not clear if we have enough bailiffs, enough enforcement officers, enough police to go and do these things as such.
And if this takes longer, this again adds more time and interest, and all of those things need to be revisited.
Another shortcoming of this system is this system doesn't even get much attention. So India over the last 10 years has done a lot of data release about the quality of the judiciary and the way the judiciary is functioning. We have now live databases about pendency in each court in India, things which even many first world countries do not provide.
Right.
There has been interest from the government. The government has tried to solve this problem, computerized filing, modern court systems, video conferencing for
Right.
cases. These are things which even countries at $7, $10, $15,000 per capita GDP sometimes do not provide. India provides that. But we don't even know, for example, if you get a judgment for $100 million, how much did you actually get?
And how long did it take?
How long did it take? And this is not just between the two parties. This brings us to the second part about this, that when a judgment of the court is not fulfilled, or a decree of the court is not fulfilled, the party who won the case goes unhappy because he won the case, he or she won the case, but still didn't get the money or the house that they're supposed to get. But it has a huge negative externality. People around see that, look, that person lost a case, nothing bad happened to that person. Then why should I respect the law? This creates more demand for police and bailiffs and systems to enforce the order. And it creates a big negative externality, this disrespect for the rule of law. Once people start disrespecting the rule of law, the amount of violence needed to enforce the rule of law increases.
Right. So it is, again, so it seems that first we spoke about legislative capacity, and now there needs to be corresponding levels of executive capacity in order to uphold whatever decree the judiciary passes.
And that capacity is not even being tracked today. We do not.
Yeah, we simply don't know. We don't know how many bailiffs, how many people, summon servers, process servers. I don't think the data exists.
Yeah, like what is the accuracy of serving someone?
Yeah. How many returns? None of that. Yeah.
How long does it take to recover money? How much money is recovered? One area we have done this and we track it. For example, in the insolvency regime, we created a separate regulator, which every few months comes up with a data release that X amount of claims in bankruptcy were made and Y amount of money was recovered and finally awarded back to the creditors of a bankrupt company. But we do not have that data, for example, for many other things like loan disputes, which are not bankruptcy, or contract disputes. This number is in some way a public good, just like a judgment is also a public good, that these things create positive reinforcement fields of enforcing the rule of law, which creates respect for the rule of law. The respect for the rule of law reduces the need for violence to enforce, state violence to enforce the rule of law. So if you have enough bailiffs and process servers and set things, then people don't try to avoid enforcement because they know it's
inevitable.
It's going to happen. And then your bailiffs and your process servers might sit in office twiddling their thumbs because not many are coming. But on the other hand, if you don't have bailiffs and process servers, then people know probably your judgment or even a court order will not be enforced, or I can delay it inordinately. And then you need more bailiffs and process servers.
Right.
So it's a paradox. Existence of the process systems leads to less users of the systems. Non-existence of the systems leads to more demand for the existence of the system.
And then it feels like, to circle back to your original statement, paradoxically, it is a well-functioning judicial system which has all these adjacent capacities of good legislation and strong executive capacity that leads to more demand for arbitration. Whereas in India, we have a flailing judicial system that isn't working up to our expectations. And you think attempting to bypass this will be ineffective because you're eventually going to be dragged to the core aspects of state capacity.
Yes, that there is no going around judiciary. There is no going around a dysfunctional legislature. There's no going around a dysfunctional executive. These are monopolistic state monopolies of the true nature.
Right.
And these are also public goods in a certain way. And we have to start thinking about the other cost of an arbitration versus a functioning judiciary. A functioning judiciary which creates high quality judgments, clarifies the law, which reduces the number of areas in which the law is unclear, where parties may have dispute or may have different of opinion of what they should have actually done. So a judgment actually helps the parties to the dispute. So in some ways, it is useful only to the parties to the dispute. But that's actually a small part of the judgment. A judgment is a huge positive externality that even parties who may not have that dispute right now, but might have it in the future, or are contemplating some similar transactions, get to read this judgment and understand how the state will act when they get into this type of transactions. So a judgment has such high positive externalities. And a judgment in some ways meets the test of a classical public good. A judgment is non-rival. When I use a judgment as a precedent, you can use it as a precedent at the same time. You cannot prevent precedents from being used by other parties. So
right.
Non-rival.
And non-excludable.
Also. And using precedents does not reduce the value of the precedent.
Right.
Unlike using oil, if you burn oil, the oil is gone. But if you have a great precedent on commercial law, you cite it in court again, it doesn't reduce. It will, in fact,
strengthens it. Yeah.
So judgments, also enforcement systems, they benefit the party who won the case. But they have an external value and they create respect for rule of law again is a important public good. Once it is there in society, everybody benefits from the society. You can't exclude people. And respecting the rule of law does not reduce the total amount of rule of law in society. So these are public goods. And basic economics teaches us that these type of core public goods should be provided by the state.
Yeah. And so we cannot bypass, or rather it would be unwise, even if you were getting great arbitration decisions because, two private parties in India knew a great arbitrator. The path to good arbitration, or to good uh, to having better alternate dispute resolution mechanisms, lies through state capacity.
Yes, because all arbitration awards, most of them are secrets between the two parties. So people don't get to see.
And it doesn't do that job of preventing future disputes by having clear stated interpretations.
Yeah.
So you may end up, like 100 different people could end up disagreeing on the same clause, and that would be arbitrated 100 times. Whereas if it goes to court once, that would set precedent if precedent was followed, etc.
And then you get that precedent, and then you can choose, okay, maybe I'll tweak the clause in a different way to get
Right.
clarity.
Right.
Therefore, I'm telling the judges this is my intention.
Right.
Because contracts have intention misinterpretation. The parties intended something, but the judge read it in a different way. If it's a public judgment, I get to see, okay, when I write it in way A, that Shubho shall deliver the goods, the court still reads it that it is maybe optional. Then maybe I will try Shubho must deliver the goods. Maybe then the court will read it as not optional, but compulsory. And that will help improve legal drafting, certainty of contracts also, which is a large part of the transactions that we do not see. Few contracts go to dispute, but there are many more contracts which are written. If they become more enforceable through clarity, through judgments, which will not happen through arbitration, a lot of potential disputes are avoided.
And that leads to a healthier economy, better contracts, more clarity, more transactions.
Yes.
So it feels that not only are you saying that arbitration in India will not be effective unless we develop legislative and executive capacity, and of course judicial capacity on the side to train the judges or the lawyers. You're also arguing that for India's state of development, arbitration might actually have negative externalities because it's preventing, through the process of judicial interpretation, it's preventing clarity, and it's preventing a good framework for commercial
Be
contracts.
very careful. Do you want to have a good arbitration system in your country with a
Weak judiciary.
without a well-functioning judiciary? Then the law becomes the property of the large repeat players who probably are in possession of arbitration awards, or only the lawyers who were party to that arbitration and know the way that arbitration thinks. So an arbitration award is just limited between the defendant, the plaintiff, the two opposite parties, the arbitrator, and the two lawyers who participated, or the two teams of lawyers who participated in that arbitration. The rest of the world doesn't get to see anything. That reduces the improvement of law of especially a core common law country, which is supposed to go from precedent to precedent. The body of law should improve and grow, and certainty should come. So yeah, it's a question to ask, that probably we need a lot of good precedents
Before we decide that arbitration is the way forward. All right. That's quite a contrarian take. Thank you, Shubho.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.